Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and an earlier show than normal, but that's to accommodate my guest to it's 1 o'clock in the morning for him over in Australia. And we are talking about a port in Australia that was a submarine base, special forces left there. There was all sorts of personnel around it, fortifications there. My guest lives pretty much, well, not pretty much, he lives there in a building that was part of the garrison and the defenses there. So it's really good. If you're new to World War II TV, because when I do a show at a different time of day, I kind of get a different audience. Don't forget to click like on the shows you watch. Maybe become a subscriber, consider becoming a patron or a channel member. All the information are in the links below, which you can use to find social media contacts, etc., etc. Without further ado, I'm going to bring my guest, Michael Nelson, in. And just before I do, he has made that transition from viewer to presenter. So it's perfectly possible. You don't have to be a published author to appear on World War II TV. You just have to have knowledge. And that's what my guest has. So I'm going to bring Michael in now. So good. Well, it's good morning. Where you are. Good morning, Michael. How are you today?
Hello, everyone. Hey, people.
So we're going to go far straight into the PowerPoint today. We're going to do questions as we go along. And it's, I have to say, when you pitched this idea to me, I'd heard of it, but I didn't know the complete variety of things that went on there. It really is quite an amazing place. I mean, I'm familiar with ports like Dover in England and Saint-Nazaire in France, but yeah, it was a huge deal in Australia for World War II before and after.
Yeah, I think the whole point was it was secret during the war as well, so not a lot of people knew about it during the war. And then I guess, as time goes by, a lot of people probably have forgotten. And one thing that I've kind of found as well, as I've obviously read a lot of books on and around the subject, because it's a port, I guess it's not necessarily the most interesting thing about submarines. So they want to, the sinking of the ships and the actual captains and all the rest of it are the ones sort of grab the attention. So quite often it might be like a one sentence passage in a whole, book on submarines or something like that. So, while it was known, it's not. I guess the scope of it isn't necessarily as widely known as probably what it should be. Particularly when you think about how sort of important submarines were in the whole sort of scheme of things in the Second World War. Yeah.
Well, there you are. Great introduction. I'll power up your PowerPoint. You're in charge of it today, so it's easy. So, folks, we'll do questions as we go along, and lots of slides, lots of information. So it might be one of those shows that you go back and watch later to kind of screen grab some of the information Michael's sharing. But basically, over to Michael to take us through this history lesson. Over to you, Michael.
Great. Thanks. All right. So I do have a lot of slides, and a lot of them are just photos. So I'll sort of skip through them. And as I kind of talked about before, there's no way that I'm going to be able to go into everything in depth. So this is more of a broad overview, I guess you could say. There's probably about, 25 different separate 1-hour shows that I'm going to go over. So apologies if I kind of run over a bit of it. I guess the only thing I might need to warn everyone about is West Australians are a bit lazy when we speak. So if I start dropping into a bit of Freo or Rotto, just might have to pick me up on that because it's what we normally call Fremantle down here anyway.
It just adds a bit of colour, Michael. It'll be good.
Yeah, we too many syllables and we get a bit stuck, so we just basically shorten words and stick O's on the end of them. So yeah, we're a simple bunch. All right, so just I've got the map there just to show you exactly where Fremantle is. It was traditionally owned by the Wajak Noongar people, and that's where the name Walyalup comes from, which is the home of the Wally, which is that little dude down there in the photo. If you don't know much about Perth, we're basically considered the most isolated capital city in the world. So if you want to get here, it's generally a long flight from anywhere. So pretty much in the middle of nowhere, which is one of the reasons, I guess, why the submarine base actually ended up becoming so important. All right, work out how to skip this. All right, cool. So just go through a quick history lesson about the Fremantle area. So a lot of the names came from when the Dutch first landed here. Most of them just weren't actually meant to come here. They just ended up getting lost. But William Vlaming was part of the Dutch East India Company, and he did a bit of exploration out here. So a lot of the place names actually came from him. So things like the Swan River and other things. So if some of the words sound a bit weird, that's because they're originally Dutch. In 1827, the French were sniffing around. So can't have that. So we British ended up putting a military base down in Albany, which is again is going to become a bit of a topic in tonight's discussion. Then 1829, the Swan River colony was established. I'm just going to cough. Okay, so Swan River colony was established. It was a free colony, unlike those dirty eastern staters. It wasn't a penal colony. It wasn't originally set up for convicts. It was essentially almost like a private venture. However, by the 1850s, the population hadn't really grown that much. So we over here needed a lot of people. British had this thing where they didn't really want to keep as many people, so they wanted to get rid of them. So between the 1850 and 1868, there was the transportation of convicts happened. That was a huge boom for Western Australia, particularly Fremantle. So a lot of, I guess what you could kind of call the traditional Fremantle buildings were built by the convicts using the local limestone that is pretty prevalent around here. One of the things interesting about that the whole convict period was the guy that ran it was actually a bit of a progressive. So he actually didn't just want to use it as a means of punishment, but actually upskilled a lot of people, gave them a lot of training, and then got found out for embezzling the government and ended up being a mercenary in China, which is a bit of a interesting story. But that was a huge influx of people, and then 1890s there was gold discovered. So again, that created a huge boost in population. And then originally the entrance of the port where the Swan River meets the ocean was actually silted up, so there wasn't a deep water port, and everything actually had to come up from Albany or down via a long jetty. By 1897, though, work commenced and they opened up the actual deep water port, which you can see in that photo, which is from 1899, which is from a hill called Cantonment Hill. And you can see that the ships actually burst in the harbour there. All right, so hopefully that map's now come up. So this is the Fremantle area that we'll be talking about a lot in tonight's talk. Top right-hand corner is the main city of Perth. Fremantle is at the mouth of the Swan River, so you can probably follow that river down. Just to the left there, to the west, is Rottnest Island, which we're going to be talking about a fair bit. And to the southwest is Garden Island, again, which we're going to be talking about. Garden Island is actually where the first settlers actually ended up, because they ran aground there. Because while it looks fairly nice and calm, there's actually quite a lot of reefs around the Fremantle entrance, which again led to some natural defences come the war. Okay, so that's just an aerial shot of the port today. The entrance of the Swan River. You can see that the beaches are to the north and to the south as well. So just quickly skip over this one. All right, so now we're going to get into the Second World War period. So Fremantle, being the western part, or the most western port, was obviously the obvious port for troops to leave for the Middle East. So once Australia entered the war, which is in 1939, obviously troops were put together and then sent out to the Middle East campaign. Those photos there are from the second AIF in 1940 leaving. Fremantle basically became the main port where all the transportation ended up leaving to go to the Middle East, and then also up into Britain. The next photo here is essentially in the early period with shipping. There was a huge issue with U-boats and that sort of thing. So the convoy system was initially established to come from Fremantle, particularly with important things like troop transportation and important sort of war requirements. It kind of wound down in sort of the 1942 period when it wasn't deemed as necessary, although there was sort of like a semi-convoy system established where essentially ships would meet up at preordained intervals to meet up, to go through sort of any tricky passages, I guess you could say, where there could be enemy activity. But again, most of the traffic from Fremantle was going out from 1940. There wasn't a huge expectation that, I guess, there was going to be any danger because the whole sort of Japanese situation hadn't arrived.
I was just going to ask you whether the fact that there was almost a slow burn situation, because you're talking about 1940, as we know, the Japanese advance doesn't happen for a good year and nearly 2 years effectively.
Yeah.
Did that help kind of with the development of Fremantle in a kind of not in a peacetime environment, but in a less pressured environment, so they could kind of get things sorted out properly at the first place? Because we know from other areas in Europe or around the world where the war kicked off immediately, it's hard to develop a system when you're already under attack.
I'd say not necessarily. Everything that sort of comes later, and one of the things that kind of is really striking is that nothing was planned. Without sort of going too deep into it, obviously Australia's pre-war defence system was basically relying on the British. So there wasn't a huge involvement in Fremantle actually becoming a port. It had been a fairly important port during the First World War, and it kind of just basically sort of picked up from where it was at the start. There wasn't a huge development. There were some plans. The British sort of realised how important it was strategically, but again, it was sort of just on paper and nothing actually was really done about it. And then in the early war period, again, there was some sort of plans put in place, but with the war breaking out in Europe, well, I guess resources were all diverted to that. So actually things kind of got put on the back burner more than actually sort of progressing up until the late 41 period. So in some ways it actually kind of slowed progress.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. All right. So just prior to war breaking out, very important sort of figure in the whole period, John Curtin, became Prime Minister. So he was essentially Australia's wartime Prime Minister between 41 and 45. He wasn't originally from Fremantle, but he did move to Fremantle early in the 20th century, and he became a Labor politician and was member for Fremantle from 1934 to 45. Very aware of the local situation, obviously being a local. He lived at a suburb just north of Fremantle called Cottesloe. So the middle colour photo there is his house. It's on Jared Street in Cottesloe. If you want to go visit, you can actually stay there because it's a National Trust owning it now, so you can sort of do short-term stays. And it's pretty much in the same condition that it was when the Curtin family lived there. Basically when Curtin came, he realised just what a predicament Australia had kind of put itself in by putting all its eggs in the British basket. He pretty much just started getting at Churchill essentially just to send some sort of support to back up. And one of the reasons wasn't just obviously the defence of Australia, but he realised that should Australia and New Zealand not necessarily fall, but get taken out of that war effort, there wouldn't be a real strategic place for anyone to actually launch any sort of offensive attacks in the future as well. And as we sort of see with the Americans and everything coming in, Australia and to a lesser extent New Zealand really sort of, I guess, provided that base, that springboard to actually then launch those counterattacks and counteroffensives in the later period. While I guess being a bit more sort of diplomatic to Churchill, the second quote there is a letter to his wife where he pretty much just says that Churchill couldn't care less really, and was really putting India first. And to be fair, most of Churchill's responses were basically, don't worry about it. It's never going to happen. So, so he was obviously a key figure in the development of Fremantle as or increasing the defensive structures around Fremantle. All right, cool. All right, so getting up into the actual outbreak of war with the Japanese. So most of the US naval fleet was based in the Philippines. In December, obviously they were fairly heavily attacked, and this is well before the fall of the Philippines. John Wilkes actually decided to evacuate. So in 29th of December, he made that decision to evacuate. First port of call was down to Java. Obviously, the way things went in that whole period, one port was falling after another, so Java became pretty untenable fairly quickly. By 1942, the call had been made to leave for Australia. Unfortunately, the decision was going to go to Darwin, which we'll find out wasn't the best decision. And so essentially the entire US Navy will evacuate and come down to Australia. All right, so we'll go to the next slide. Like I said, it wasn't the greatest move to go to Darwin because fairly quickly Darwin was bombed, and I know you've done a talk on that, which was a fairly severe attack. A couple of more little-known attacks were the attacks on Northwest Australia, which happened fairly quickly after. So on the 3rd of March, Broome and Wyndham were both attacked by Japanese planes. The sad thing about the attack on Broome, while 88 people were listed as killed, that's only officially. The bay was filled with seaplanes that had been escaping Java. There's a lot of Dutch refugees on those planes. So 88 was really just the amount of bodies they found. There could have been quite a number of other people that perished in those attacks. But essentially it meant that Northwest Australia was sort of out of bounds in terms of being, I guess you could call safe from any Japanese attacks. The one thing that it did really spark up in Australia was that threat of an invasion. So all of a sudden the war had actually sort of come home. And then you can see a lot in the newspapers and the different sort of media, just that those invasion fears. The poster on the right there is referencing one of Curtin's speeches, which was "It's fight, work or perish," which became sort of a motto for the Australian government during this period.
And just to jump in and give you a break, Michael, as well, yeah. I think Curtin is someone that is obviously talked about a lot in Australia, but is talked about less around the world. And yet, to me, he very much was a globalist. He was always thinking about Australia, but also the problems of the world and connecting all the dots. You know, as Indy and Spartacus say on their channel, you know, nothing happens in a vacuum. He seemed to be broad picture, but also focused on Australia's defence as well. And I think, you know, he doesn't come up very much in writings about Churchill from Brits and MacArthur from Americans, but in Australia, he looms large in so much of your country's policy making and attitude and everything. And it's a shame that he's not more discussed outside of the country, I think.
Yeah, like I said, from everything I've sort of read, he was, I guess a lot of people sort of praise Churchill for having that sort of forward-thinking attitude in terms of being able to sort of see things before they happened, and you know, being able to sort of call out those issues. He certainly was one. Yeah, I think everything, especially in the early war period, kind of he was sort of ended up being sort of proved right, and even fairly sort of savvy political operator when MacArthur comes on board as well, in terms of how he could sort of leverage MacArthur to you know, Australia's advantage in terms of defence. So yeah, definitely an important figure in I guess the history of Australia. But yeah, definitely in terms of not just outside of the war, there was a lot of other things that I guess you could say were positive moves that he made. Alrighty, cool. All right, so now we're sort of getting to Fremantle. So the first people that got here weren't necessarily the US, but they're actually refugees from fleeing Singapore and from the Java area. So a lot of British people escaping Singapore. A lot of them would end up going back to Britain. There were a lot of Dutch people that ended up being put into camps, refugee camps in Western Australia. The two ships down the bottom are both refugee ships that were in Fremantle in early 42. The larger photo is of, again, a fairly sort of little known story. There was 500 Chinese sailors that were on board these ships when they got to Fremantle. They basically, because everything had fallen apart, they weren't getting paid, and they were just sort of stuck on a ship with nowhere to go. Essentially the decision was made to draft them into the army, so they became part of what was known as the Labour Corps or Asian Labour Force. So they were used on the port. There was, not just in Fremantle, but right around Australia, there were these different sort of non-native, I guess you could say, labour corps that were set up to just help out the army in terms of different things that are required in terms of infrastructure. As the quote goes, that the harbour was completely full of refugee boats at this stage. It was sort of lining up, I think, 4 at a time, and there was more waiting in the harbour as those left to bank up, which again put a huge strain on the port. And with everything being not really thought about before, or I guess the infrastructure hadn't been set up, there was a lot of things had to put in place quite quickly to deal with this number of people. And like I said, there was refugee camps sort of set up all along down in southwest Australia to support these ones that had tried to escape the Japanese. Okay, so now we're going to get into the US Navy appearing. So again, as the ports in the northwest of Australia just basically became unusable because of the Japanese presence, it was important to get to a safe harbour, and the nearest harbour from the Southeast Asian area was Fremantle. The important point with the whole submarine operations wasn't necessarily getting the submarines out, but it was getting these tenders to safety. Essentially, without the tenders, you don't have a submarine force, because they're the ones who are the ones that actually sort of fit them out and maintain them while they're at sea. Most of them were fairly limited in armament, so might have like an anti-aircraft gun or something on there, but they weren't a battleship. They weren't able to sustain any main attack. The big fear with the Navy, and I guess with Australia as well, was the threat of another carrier-borne attack or land-based area attack by the Japanese. That the Americans at this stage, by the time you had Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and all the Philippines, they're fairly paranoid about the threat of another Japanese carrier attack and air attack. The northwest of Australia was still within range of some of the long-range Japanese bombers and fighters as well. So again, it didn't really make much sense to have them up there. So Fremantle, again, being so isolated, ended up being a bit of a boon for the Navy at this stage because it was so far away. The Holland, which is the top photo, arrived on the 3rd of March. So it was actually the first ship to come in from the Navy, and it came along with a couple of submarines. Over the next couple of weeks, there's about 10 submarines that had arrived in port, along with 2 of the tenders, which were the Holland and the Otis. Again, that fear remained that there was going to be this Japanese invasion or another large-scale Japanese attack. So the decision was made to actually divert the Holland and 5 submarines even further south. So they all went down to Albany, which is on the south coast. again, just to keep them safe, because there was this huge fear of Japanese invasion at this stage, or at least a major Japanese attack. Thing to note was because nothing was planned, these submarines didn't actually have maps to get down to Fremantle or charts. So the reports that I read, they were using old National Geographic magazines and things as charts to actually get down, while the Japanese had obviously done their homework and had very high quality maps and reconnaissance photos from before the war. So yeah, it was all, nothing was planned. Everything was really ad hoc, and I think it sort of remained that way for a while. But I guess for me, that's the kind of spirit and the thing that I really enjoy about the story, because there was nothing planned, but in the end it actually worked out really well. And it shows sort of the cooperation and the people behind it to make it work. Okay, so this is just a story of one of the submarines that had arrived, which is the USS Sargo. The commander, Jacobs, during that sort of December period while the retreating from the Philippines went out on patrol, it was reported that he fired 13 torpedoes at various targets and they all missed. He was adamant that there was an issue with the torpedoes at this time, and that becomes a big issue later on, to the point where he actually, over open radio, which was complete no-no, actually was starting to abuse people about the torpedoes, and potentially could have got court-martialed over it, because he was basically telling the Japanese that the torpedoes weren't working, because they were obviously listening onto those radio frequencies. I think with everything going on, I think he was actually just let off because of what happens next. On the 25th, they loaded a heap of evacuees, so 31 evacuees coming down from Fremantle. So a lot of these submarines, internal, bringing evacuees and refugees. Some would return back up to the Philippines and pick people up from there. On the 4th of March, so a day outside of arriving in Fremantle, there was obviously this invasion threat. One of the USS destroyers had said, we've spotted a Japanese submarine. The 48th Squadron were alerted and sent out a Hudson, which spotted a submarine innocently approaching harbour and decided to bomb it. Caused massive damage. Luckily, it didn't sink, but it was a pretty interesting story. They basically had to hold it at a certain depth because they worked out that the doors weren't going to fall in with pressure until they could come up at night, and then eventually limp into port the next day. Basically, by this time, Jacobs, in that quote there, said he actually resigned from his post and couldn't go on because of the issues with the torpedoes, and then again, getting bombed when he's supposed to be coming to safety. Okay, so I've just called this slide the beginning. So again, there was nothing really planned. It all just sort of happened as it happened. So with the arrival of the tenders, more and more submarines started to come into port. So by the end of March 22, submarines from the US Navy, and then there was also 3 additional Dutch submarines which had escaped from the Dutch East Indies, had arrived in Fremantle. A few Dutch submarines ended up going to Sri Lanka, where the British base was. Again, there's nothing set up for submarines at that stage. It was not really a huge maintenance infrastructure at all in terms of for Navy personnel. There were some Australian Navy engineers and mechanics that were around to work on the Australian Navy force, and they ended up working on these American submarines. Basically, they had to winch them out of the water kind of by hand to work on them because there was no other sort of facilities for it. The bottom photo is, so this is a whole other story. It's definitely a show worth a show in itself. 10 Patrol Wing left the Philippines They had 22 planes in 2 squadrons. They were part of the attack in Broome, so they lost some planes in Broome. By the time they made it to Perth, they only had 3 left. And luckily, they had some tenders. They regrouped, and yeah, the whole Catalina story out of WA is definitely worth a show in itself. But they were part of the people that had managed to make it out of the evacuation of the Philippines.
I'm writing that one down, Michael.
Yeah, honestly, yeah. If I don't suck too much, I'd happily come back and talk about the Catalina.
You're not sucking. People are loving it. Don't worry.
Okay. All right. So just quickly, these are the Dutch submarines that arrived. Funnily enough, they were better suited for the operations that were to be done because they were designed by Dutch engineers to work in warm water. So they were air conditioned. They were quite well designed, probably better designed than the American ones. Unfortunately, because they were designed by the Dutch and the problems that the Dutch had, there was no way of getting parts and maintenance for them. So one of them was scrapped completely and ended up being scuttled in the harbour. K9 became the only submarine owned by the Royal Australian Navy during the war. Essentially, the Australian Navy took it over as part of anti-submarine training, and it became part of what we're going to talk about, some of the Commando training that came later. That, again, didn't last too long up to the war. And then the 3rd submarine there was able to be repaired, and it did do some patrol duties during the war. And from memory, I'm pretty sure it ended up being part of a theme park around Sydney after the war. Okay. All right. So, like I said, there weren't any facilities really for the repair of submarines. The big thing, obviously, about submarines is they're underwater, so you have to bring them out of the water to do any maintenance work on them, especially things like painting them, getting the surfaces clean, making sure that they're anti-magnetized, so for mines and things like that. So that all requires the submarine to come out of the water. So that really pushed the Australian authorities to get this slipway up and going. So there was again, this was a plan pre-war, got put on hold with the outbreak of war, and then obviously with the Americans arriving, it had to get quickly ramped up to be built. The colour photo there is it currently, so it's part of the West Australian Maritime Museum now, and that's a Cold War submarine that's currently located on the Slipway, so you can actually go visit this facility. What this essentially, when this was built, was a bit of a game changer, because previously any major sort of repair work meant the submarine had to go all the way back to Pearl Harbor and then come all the way back before it could go back into action. With the construction of the Slipway, it meant that pretty much all the work could be done within the Fremantle Harbour, which obviously saved a lot of time and meant that the submarines could get turned around and get back out to sea a lot quicker. Okay, so did say I was going to introduce some sort of commando raids. So this is the first recorded interaction between US submarines and Australian commando forces that I could find anyway. This is the rescue of Sparrow Force. Again, this is a whole show in itself. So the second independent company were inserted into Timor to do guerrilla activities and reconnaissance around the outbreak of the war with Japan. The Sea Raven was sent to rescue these men that were kind of essentially got caught behind enemy lines and needed rescue. The RAAF tried to get in there. One of the ideas that was floated to it was to actually just land a Hudson on the beach, which probably wasn't going to work very well. And the only seaplane that was going to be big enough was one of those big Empire planes, which I think there's only 2 of them in Australia, so that wasn't going to work either. So the Navy, US Navy found out, and Commander Cassidy was sent with the Sea Raven to go pick these guys up. The bravery of these guys was insane, because this is, again, when the Japanese had complete stranglehold on this area. They remained out at sea for a number of days while men had volunteered to actually go in and try and find these guys, because, again, communications weren't that great. They didn't actually have a boat that had a motor, or any oars, so the men that had to get out to pick these guys up were just using bits of wood and stuff that they found in the submarine to paddle out there and pick them up. Eventually, they made contact with the remaining force of Sparrow Force, and managed to rescue 33 soldiers over 2 nights. Which is, again, the bravery of all these guys is absolutely insane. But yeah, that's essentially, I'm fairly sure that was the first interaction between the Navy and Australian Commando forces anyway. Okay, all right, so this is the main man, Charles Lockwood. He's integral with the entire submarine operation. He arrived in May to relieve Wilkes, who essentially had already come to the end of his term as submarine commander. Obviously, with everything happening, he actually couldn't get away, so he wasn't replaced for any reasons of negligence, but just simply that he sort of had come to the end of his term there. Lockwood was sent out. This is the start of his essentially his memoir, which is entitled Sink 'Em All. Obviously, just in a nutshell, the American forces were pretty demoralised at this stage. He had gone into Albany with Jimmy Fife, who would end up being commander of the submarine force later on, expecting to sort of see a lot of guys downtrodden and sad-faced, but basically found them all sitting around a piano singing this song, Sink 'Em All, Sink 'Em All, with the local girls, which, again, just shows that how quickly the Australian and the US forces sort of hit it off. And also how many times Lockwood mentions the beers and the girls of Perth, which is quite often. So
interesting you mentioned that, because a lot of our viewers are American, and the relationship between Australia and America, from my understanding of World War II, was generally pretty good, maybe even better than the British and American relationship, where there was some strains here and there. But it seems that a lot of the legacy that we're left with are the more infrequent dark incidents, like the American soldier who murdered a string of young women in whichever city that was in, and MacArthur got involved, and those stories have ended up being remembered, the darker moments. And actually, as you were saying there, the longer story of good cooperation seems to have been lost, because I guess it doesn't sell books, does it?
No.
Conflict and negativity sells books. A good positive relationship doesn't.
Yeah, pretty much. And I think also it just reflected the attitude of the Australians at the time. They were under threat. They felt that invasion was around the corner. As much as the Americans were on the back foot as well, having all of a sudden all these Navy personnel show up while there was no, huge Australian contingent at that stage. They were sort of seen as saviors, and I think that's one of the reasons why there was that sort of not so to say that there weren't incidents where things got out of hand, but for the most part, the two sort of parties connected pretty quickly, pretty well. Okay, so already mentioned the issue with the torpedoes. Lockwood was as someone who actually listened to his commanders and had heard all the complaints. So he actually took it on himself to do some trials. So while he was down in Albany, the skipjack, which only had 3 torpedoes left, used all 3 of them to fire into a net that they bought off a local fisherman. And those trials essentially proved what his commanders had been saying, that the Mark 14 torpedo just wasn't working properly. There were additional issues that sort of came out later on, but this test from Lockwood went straight up the chain of command and basically started rattling a few cages, and was probably the main sort of catalyst that got the ball rolling and actually getting these changes made. It wasn't up until sort of end of 1943 that a lot of those changes ended up getting made. It was pretty faulty in a lot of ways, that torpedo, and you can see by the end of 43 and into 44, when this torpedo was fixed, the amount of shipping that was additional shipping that was sunk, not just because of this, but it was definitely a huge factor in that.
And just so I can say rabbit hole, so people can have a drink, I could do a week, 2 weeks, or a month of shows about American torpedoes in World War II with Craig Simons and Trent Hone and Trent Telenko, and we probably still, after a month of shows, will never exhaust all the discussion points about American and indeed Allied torpedoes in World War II.
Yeah,
so it's a
I'm just sort of focusing on the local aspect of it, but again, that's probably another couple of shows in and of itself, just the outworkings of that. Okay, all right. So next slide. Again, with nothing planned in terms of having all these servicemen sort of rocking up unannounced, there's a lot of sort of quick fixes put in place to accommodate them. The cover photo in the top left-hand corner is one of those buildings I spoke about, a sort of traditional convict building out of limestone, originally built as a women's asylum back when, I don't know, essentially whenever there was something wrong with a female, they just decided she was mad and locked her up. So the women's asylum was set up. It wasn't running as a women's asylum. Obviously by then it was turned into a barracks and could house around 600 personnel at any one time. The bottom left-hand corner is a few guys that were located there. Essentially, that was like I guess you call it a dispersal barracks. So when the sailors would arrive, they'd bill it there for a couple of nights, and then they'd head out into more permanent barracks, which were usually hotels. So there's about 8 hotels that ended up being hired by the Navy at its peak in and around Perth and some of the other suburbs that would house these. The admirals and the chiefs all had private houses, and funnily enough, they all chose the most expensive suburb in Perth just to stay. So a lot of them ended up in around Nedlands, which is a riverside suburb. Yeah, pretty pricey real estate even back in the day. So they weren't slumming it, that's for sure. And a number of the wool stores that were set up for the port ended up being taken over by the Americans as storage yards as well. So some of them were leased directly from the owners. Some were given to them by the government, as Australian government as well, as part of just to assist them. So a bit of private ownership and a bit of, I guess you could say, help from the government as well. Okay, so now I'm just going to get into what we were talking about before, settling in with the locals. Again, this is another quote from Charles Lockwood. One thing that comes through with all the interviews that you read from servicemen is just how much they enjoyed coming to Fremantle, especially for their 2 weeks rest. The other options were Midway Island, where it was essentially wasn't much there. So Fremantle was definitely a better option than that. And again, there's no end of compliments for whatever reason for the beer and the girls as well. Okay. All right. So every American serviceman was issued one of these. 1942 instructions for American servicemen in Australia. Kind of reads like someone never actually been to Australia when you read through it, or they just, I don't know, watched an early copy of Crocodile Dundee or something. But essentially, all Australians were hard as nails bushmen that liked to swear a lot and didn't have any manners, which essentially gave all the American soldiers a bit of a leg up when they got to port and realised that their manners could go a long way with the local girls. As it says in the bottom corner, the Americans were impressed by the Australians' knack of swearing, which is interesting because they really talk about how much the Australian likes to use the word bloody. In the British one, they said you probably shouldn't use the word bloody, so something different.
I love those cultural guides. They're interesting now, and they were interesting then because they're definitely kind of antiquated now, and they probably weren't perfect back when they were done. There was that American film with Burgess Meredith talking about how Americans should go into British pubs, and the intentions are really good, but they often were really 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 iffy.
It was like someone had just seen the stereotypical Australian bushman or something, and then just wrote a whole story about it. But yeah, pretty funny now to read through.
Brilliant stuff.
Okay, so just to highlight, I guess what we said there, the Americans ended up being quite popular with the ladies. The quote from Sid Harvey: the Yanks were popular with the girls. They used to go around with a bunch of flowers in their hand. We used to think that was bloody stupid. It was essentially, the Americans, with all their manners that apparently Australians didn't have, end up being a bit of a hit. The Swan Dive was essentially almost like a nightclub type situation that was set up by the Americans. End up being really popular, obviously, with service personnel. Every night there was like a different show. There was hostesses. I included the photo in the bottom right because like Black American, African Americans were actually allowed to go in there, which was quite surprising for the time, because obviously the American Navy at the time was fairly segregated. And despite what a couple of, I guess, sort of, I don't know what you call them, newspapers, but more rags, I guess you call it, back in the day, tried to beat up on the racial element, particularly if, shock horror, a girl was caught with a black serviceman. But for the most part, the race relations actually were sort of fairly good.
And it's interesting just you mentioned that, because I did that show maybe a year or so ago with Dr. Gene Smith about Durban in South Africa, and how it was a huge topic of conversation there, how to segregate or not segregate between civilian and military and African personnel and people coming in from other parts of the world, and New Zealand soldiers coming through, and it was it was really complicated. It was the biggest thing they discussed in Durban in World War II, is how to do it, and they ended up coming up with these ideas of managing things to. But yeah, that aspect of people from different backgrounds encountering each other in a port environment was a complicated one in World War II, and again, a subject for a further discussion in the future.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, West Australia in the 1940s wasn't exactly woke when it came to race relations. Yeah, definitely anyone that wasn't white was always sort of viewed with a bit of suspicion. But like I said, most of the beat up was just in some of the more, I don't know, rag type newspapers that really trying to beat up that racial element more than probably what it was. One thing that, again, sort of reading through interviews that came through was It was more between the American the white servicemen and the black servicemen where there were issues more so than necessarily with the Australians.
Yep.
And also, probably the darkest moment in Fremantle was because there was a lot of obviously New Zealander Maoris coming in as well. Americans didn't really know what to make of them because were they black, were they white? There was a bit of racial tension between the Americans and the Maoris, to the point where 2 Maoris were actually stabbed and killed at a pub in Fremantle due to the tensions between those two groups. Sort of more reflecting, I guess, the segregation from the American side of it than necessarily the local Australian side of it. Again, not to say that West Australia in the 40s was particularly progressive when it came to race at all, particularly when you read some of the comments. Cool. All right. So, again, West Australia essentially sort of opened its doors. Fremantle opened its doors for these servicemen and tried to make them feel at home as much as possible. So there were a lot of organised hospitality arrangements that were put in place to accommodate the sailors when they're on leave. So big things were things like horse riding. There'd be organised hunting parties, the top right-hand corner. Those type of things were all organised.
I'm waiting for Michael to come back in. I hope I'm still talking to you. Don't forget, folks, we've got we seem to have well, we're back. Yep, we're back. Hello again.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry, I don't know what happened. It dropped out.
I think it was my end. I think it was problem with the internet, but we're back. I think just got to load up your PowerPoint again. But I think we're still here. We're still broadcasting. Sorry about that, folks. Oh no, your screen is there. We go.
Yeah, I'll just get back to where we were.
There we go.
Cool.
I panicked there for a second or two. I thought, am I still there?
Yeah, I was like, is this normal? All right. Okay, so this is the hospitality arrangements. Like I said, these are all organised by different associations, the Red Cross and other associations for the sailors. There are also a number of free hostels. So the bottom left-hand corner is Philistine Hostel, which was opened. Essentially, any of the servicemen could go in there for a free meal, and they offer free accommodation as well. The legends in the middle, the bunch of ladies that ran a canteen in Fremantle that was free for all Allied servicemen to go there, get a meal and a cup of tea. Not only was it all free and they volunteered their time, they actually they get paid to maintain it as well. So they actually dipped into their own funds to make that happen, and they did that through the whole war period. And obviously, the bottom right-hand corner is a lot of dances and sort of different events were organised when these sailors were in. So quite often, you'd sort of see an invitation go out to a certain submarine or whatever for when they came into port, and they could go to a certain organisation or dance or something like that. So again, just I guess sort of shows that appreciation that those servicemen actually come here. By the local population.
All right. So the idea of kangaroo hunting. In my dating days, back in my youth, that was never a date. When I was thinking about inviting some young lady somewhere, I never thought about kangaroo hunting. Obviously, there aren't many in Essex, north of London. But it was never on my radar to invite someone on a kangaroo hunting. For your date.
Yeah. Pretty much. Like wherever the girls were, that's where they went. Like there was an instance where all these servicemen went out to watch sheep getting sheared. And why anyone would be interested in going out and see that. But obviously there was a lot of girls there, so that's why I ended up going. On that subject, also a lot of local residents opened up their houses for these guys to stay at, particularly a lot of rural properties. So a lot of these guys came from farms previously, and they would go out and spend time on the farm, help out, which worked out well for both, because obviously they got a bit of recreation and something away from the Navy, and also helped out on the farm as well, because a lot of the guys who had actually left and gone to the forces, and so they needed the help on the farm as well. All right, so just going to go into the defence of Fremantle. Like I said, there wasn't really much of a defence at the outbreak of war. The building top left is the artillery barracks, which was set up just prior to the First World War. So all port defences at that time were actually part of the Royal Australian Artillery. So it wasn't the Navy that controlled the defence, it was actually the artillery, which was a separate branch of the armed forces at that stage. And so they were in charge of defending the port. They only had a couple of antiquated 6-inch guns at that stage to defend, which are the photos in the bottom. And from what I found, I think they might have had 4 anti-aircraft guns at the start of the war, and that's about it. All right, so quickly get into these two guys, both fairly controversial figures. So the heartthrob on the left, that's Blamey. Yeah, he was a school teacher in Fremantle prior to the First World War, so he was acutely aware of, I guess, the deficiencies in the defence, and he wrote in his memoirs just how undefended the West Australian coast was, and especially down in Albany as well. His response was the creation of 3 Corps, which General Gordon Bennett, who controversially left Singapore, was appointed as chief of that, probably more to get him out of the way than as any kind of promotion. And knowing Blamey, that's probably all he did, and then he went down to the pub to chat up the barmaids. All right. Also, there was a creation of Western Air Command, which covered the air defences as well. All right. Now, the big guy enters the stage. MacArthur had got his hands on a report by Vice Admiral Leary. He was in charge of the naval forces before MacArthur even arrived. He commissioned a report onto the defences, which obviously found that they were pretty lacking. MacArthur obviously coming in and, we're going to save the world or die trying, issued a memo saying that the defences of the ports drastically needed overhauling. One of the things that he implemented essentially was a standardized defense strategy. So American-made guns, American ammunition, and I guess a checklist of defenses that would go out to each of these ports to defend, particularly in New Guinea as well, but also some of the major ports in Australia. Okay, so the left-hand side is what would become known as the Fremantle Fixed Defences, or I guess sounds a bit more sexy, the Fremantle Fortress. So there were going to be batteries placed at all those different locations. The photo is one of the guns that was there down in Point Perry. So that's the 155mm gun that MacArthur was asking. So that would supplement the defences that were already getting constructed by the Australian artillery. Not all of those batteries would end up getting commissioned by the end of the war. Some were sort of in the progress, and obviously the war ended, so they didn't sort of get right to the end, but the majority of them were up and running by the 43-44 period. All right, so let's go into Rottnest. I would probably get my West Australian citizenship revoked if I didn't have a photo of a quokka when mentioning Rottnest. So that's where Rottnest gets its name. The Dutch, thinking they were rats, called it Ratsnest or Rottnest, and hence it gave its name. Not sure they were going to put up much of a defence, but anyway, put the photo in there anyway.
Well, they were never given the opportunity. You know,
that's it. I don't know.
You can't dismiss them as a fighting force until you let them have a test. You know, have they got opposable thumbs to hold the grips of anti-aircraft guns? That's the question.
Maybe, yeah. So that photo, and it's a fairly iconic photo. Some Wirraways flying above Rottnest. So Rottnest is located just off the coast of about 20 kilometres or so off the coast of Fremantle. It had always traditionally been a place where there was a lighthouse and would be the sort of gateway into Fremantle. Like I said previously, there's a lot of reefs around the Fremantle area, and there was only sort of one narrow passage, which was known as the gauge roads, where ships could enter. So even sort of back in the early days, there'd be pilot ships that would leave Rottnest and lead ships through into Fremantle Harbour. Strategically, it was really important because it was off the coast. Also, from the higher hills, you could have a full 360-degree view of the harbour and all the sort of surrounding areas. This was sort of highlighted just before the war began. So there was a huge build-up of forces on the island and construction of defences, which were then added to as the war progressed. So one of my friends is a photographer in Rottnest, so he sent me this photo. This is of the Oliver Hill gun battery. So this is a massive 9.2-inch gun that could fire almost 30 kilometres. So it can actually fire back and actually hit the mainland of Australia. And that had 360-degree view. So this was put in because essentially it was going to be a longer range than anything that the enemy could usually come in and fire upon. And that was going to be the main defence should any attack be made. Like I said, at Starlord, there was probably maybe 4 guns, anti-aircraft guns in around the Fremantle area. By sort of 44 period, there was around 70 guns located in different batteries around the area. Some were manned by the Volunteer Defence Corps, which was essentially sort of like the Home Guard in Britain. So a lot of them were sort of First World War First World War troops that joined these groups and form part of the local defence. And there was also sort of supplemented by actual anti-aircraft troops as well. So there was for gunners, the Bofors and the 3.7-inch flat guns that were installed as well.
Just a quick question for you, Michael. It may be coming up later. Ian Carr is asking, how familiar the Japanese have been with the Fremantle Harbour and coastline from pre-war trade?
Yeah, really familiar. So there was a Japanese presence in Fremantle prior in terms of trade. I was just reading the other day. There's actually a Japanese brothel was set up to accommodate the Japanese sailors. Not only that, they had obviously done their homework before the war in terms of sending out seaplanes from the submarines to do reconnaissance of all the major metropolitan areas of Australia. I did have it, and I couldn't find it for this show, but they had extremely detailed maps of Australia, with all the place names and everything, notated in Japanese. They were completely familiar with the surroundings and everything that was going on. Whether by the end of it they were up to speed with all the operations in terms of the submarine base. I'm not too sure, because by that stage they weren't probably able to do as much reconnaissance. So unless it was sort of code breaking and things like that, probably not as much. But in terms of pre-war, yeah, they would have had a complete idea of what was going on. Okay, so this is just going to highlight a couple of the gun batteries, mainly because they're still standing, so you can actually go visit them today. This is the 6-inch gun emplacement at Leighton, which is a beach just to the north of the Fremantle. These guns were moved up from the original Fremantle harbour, pretty much because where they put them in Fremantle wasn't a great idea, because they would actually probably hit Allied ships before they hit the Japanese ones. So they decided to move them up onto this hill. Again, sort of harking back to all the limestone in the area, they were able to build these massive tunnels into the hillside, which had all the ammunition. And the sort of darker photo is like a little observation thing that was actually basically dug into the side of the hill. So essentially it was designed to be completely safe from any Japanese attack or bombardment from the sea. That was essentially to protect the harbour as ships were going in, and then you had Rottnest, which is out to the west, which is going to be the main sort of defence. So one of the things that really, I guess, stands out with the Fremantle defences was just how much the women's auxiliary forces were involved. So I think there was around 10,000 troops all up that we used in terms of defence for the West Australian coast. About 3,000 of them were women, so almost 30%. Essentially, they did everything apart from firing the main guns. But in terms of doing all the spotting, which is the photo on the bottom left there, which is the same place that the previous photo was taken from. There in the bigger photo, they were doing training on anti-aircraft guns. So but essentially, women had a huge role in the defence thing. From memory, the Women's Auxiliary Service started up in 41, and by sort of 42, 43, they were pretty much all over the place in terms of the Fremantle defences. So that was the AOS, which was the Army Auxiliaries, and the next slide is probably my favourite slide of the whole show. This is the RANs, the Navy Auxiliaries. So this is a signalling station which was set up on these big sort of grain silos that were in the port at that stage, that they don't exist anymore, but they were a signalling station that would basically, you could see from Rottnest. So they'd go up on there and signal the Rottnest fire control. There was an incident where one of the American submarines failed to acknowledge the signalers and ended up calling on an artillery barrage on them, although it quickly realised it was a bit of a mistake, and that was stopped. But again, just sort of highlights the role of women in the whole period, which again is super important and a bit of a massive change coming from where it was. Also, again, one of the massive changes was because of all the men that were left, the women started becoming barmaids, which was caused a bit of an issue in Fremantle as well, because the guys who worked on the wharf weren't used to girls pouring their beers. All right. This photo here is just the bonefish entering the harbour. So this is the Fremantle harbour. Just put this photo in because at the back is the HMS AS Adelaide, which is just in the insert there. That was a fairly old ship that was pretty much due to be decommissioned. But obviously with the outbreak of war and Australia losing a whole lot of its ships in various conflicts, it was used for patrol work and essentially remained the only ship that was really based out of Fremantle, apart from a couple of Dutch ships that came and went in terms of patrolling and a defence. Okay, this is some of the other defences that were set up. Top left-hand corner is the boom net. So net was put up to stop any torpedo or submarine attacks that come into the harbour. The interesting thing about that was the Dutch submarine that was scrapped. They ended up using the engines from that to actually power the boom nets, and was one of the first motorised boom nets in the world from memory. And the photo on the right was a massive construction effort of these barricades that were put up between Garden Island and Fremantle. So about 9.5 kilometres worth of these barricades were set up. Some are still underwater, so there's been some archaeology done recently to show it. And then obviously a lot of it was taken down after the war, and I think a lot of it ended up in people's backyards. All right, so to quickly go over the air defences. So Western Area Command was set up around 41, 42 for the defences of Perth and the Fremantle. There were different squadrons that came in and went, but these are the three main that were actually set up for the defence of Fremantle. So first was the 25 Squadron, which had wheelrays, which were in the previous photo of Rottnest. And then they got the Volti Vengeance dive bombs. Eventually they were converted to Liberators, and the top right-hand corner shows the City of Perth Squadron, so the Black Swan emblem, which is the state emblem on the tail there. Everything was coordinated through radar stations that were set up. The Army, essentially all the services all sort of, even though they were separate, all combined. So the Air Force would have a radar station right next to where the Navy and the artillery would also have their defences all set up as well. So that was all coordinated. And then that would all go back to the base at Pearce. This is 14
Just a quick
Squadron.
question for you. I'll do it while it's there from Kevin.
Yep.
Completely off subject. You may or may not know the answer. Were there any spies in Australia for the Japanese? Off at a tangent, he's admitting.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't think so. I don't know.
I don't think so. Yeah. Someone will jump in and say yes or no.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Obviously, there'd have to be Europeans working for the Japanese. I'm not sure if that was the case.
We'll see.
Yes, sorry, I don't really know the answer.
No worries. That's a great photo on screen, by the way. What an amazing photo. Yeah,
so this 14 Squadron, so they were torpedo bombers that essentially were set up for the period of the war. They did some absolutely massive patrols. So like I said, up to about 22 hours. So they would go right up to Exmouth in the north and then down to Albany in the south. They'd have to patrol the whole coastline. The photo that I've chosen there, so that front plane sadly crashed, and all I think 7 members of the crew died just north of Perth. So yeah, rather sad story. And had to put a boomerang in here. So 85 Squadron, they were essentially almost like a hand-me-down squadron. They just got everyone else's leftovers. So they got some Buffaloes, some boomerangs, and then eventually got some Spitfires. But they were the only major air defence squadron that was located in the area. But yeah, they were only around for a couple of years before they were shut down. Okay, so this is the West Australian emergency of March 1944. So again, that sort of threat of invasion and attack was always present with the locals and even with the Americans. By sort of 44, the Allies had obviously broken Japanese codes and were fairly aware of the movements, and there was suspicions because of a lot of the Japanese naval movements that they were potentially going to launch an attack into the Indian Ocean, with Fremantle being the obvious point where they were going to come and attack. Sorry, those texts are not that great on this slide. Essentially, 3 heavy cruisers were sent into the Indian Ocean. The Haddo, USS Haddo, which was commanded by Chester Nimitz Jr., which is the son of Nimitz Sr., the famous Nimitz Sr., alerted the base that there's potential for an attack. The ships that he spotted ended up not actually coming into the Indian Ocean. They were going somewhere else, but there were actually ships coming in, so it wasn't the same ones. They were sent essentially on a mission to disrupt any shipments going between the Middle East and Australia at that time. So anywhere between the Middle East and Fremantle. Everything was basically put on high alert. All the submarines were sent out to sea. The tenders were sent down to Adelaide, and all other shipping was moved out to sea to try and obviously not present as much of an attack point of attack as what could be. The ships did end up sinking a British merchant ship, which is the Bahar. They picked up 104 survivors. The commander basically then just got hauled over the coals by the higher ups as to why he picked up survivors, and then so they ended up executing them all. And this is probably one of the few cases where someone actually ended up getting in trouble for it. So the guy on the right, he was ended up being executed in 1948 for the execution of all those. And they were also, I think a lot of them were Indian sailors that were on board that ship. So basically, essentially, the threat hadn't ceased. All right, so 43, 44, it's called this the Christie era. So Lockwood ended up going back to the Pearl Harbor and heading up the submarine fleets operating out of the Pacific area under what was MacArthur's command. So Christie had moved in. He's a bit of a tough character, I think, to kind of get my head around. Very competent, very brave. Also, from everything that I kind of read, very stubborn and probably quite arrogant. Unlike Lockwood, who kind of listened to his men and sort of was known as a bit of a gentleman, not a lot of his subordinates had a lot of high praise for Christie. Him and Lockwood didn't necessarily get along as well either, because Christie had spent a lot of time working on the sort of infamous Mark 14 torpedo. He was a member of the Bureau of Ordnance, that was called at that stage. So he was a massive advocate for it, said that there was nothing wrong with it. Essentially, it was all the captain's fault or maintenance crew. Lockwood obviously had done tests on it and was pretty anti the torpedo at that stage, so that they were basically at loggerheads because of that. And also, early in 43, a lot of the submarines had been diverted from Fremantle and went back to Brisbane to support the various sort of operations through the Solomons and things like that. So he, again, was sort of on the outs with Lockwood at that stage, just because he'd lost a lot of his troops. So I think it was, they had 8 submarines at the start. By the end of 44, there was 57 submarines operating out of Fremantle. They were supplemented by the British, adding to flotillas as well, with a few Dutch submarines. Christie, to his credit, realised that the big key was going after the oil tankers. So there was a massive push for going after merchant shipping, and less so for going after, I guess, like the more military Japanese naval type shipping. And that's where a lot of the success came from. These are just a few photos to show just the scope of the naval operation. So that's the Polias, which is the tender that was the main tender in Fremantle for most of the period, with US submarines. The next one just shows the massive submarines at port at any one time. So these are all attached to the tenders, be in port for a couple of weeks, and then they'd head back out for another around 4 to 6 weeks on patrol from Fremantle. Just a photo of the auxiliary repair dock. This thing's just absolutely massive, 150 meters long, could handle anything up to a destroyer. That came in 1944. Again, that just enabled the maintenance of all the American ships at that stage, and then later on the British when they arrived. That photo
just to be clear, at this point, this is pretty the Fremantle is pretty hush hush. This information isn't being disseminated to the people of Australia and around the world. This is all fairly
no. Essentially, it was a secret. Obviously, because they didn't want the operations getting out and the Japanese knowing about it. Obviously, it was pretty hard to keep a secret all those submarines that are sitting in the harbour and the amount of sailors that were in port. But in terms of the operations, nothing was really let out to the public until essentially it was shut down in 45. So in 45, you started seeing newspaper reports about it. But up until that, everything was fairly heavily censored in terms of what was going on. Like I said, apart from obviously people with eyes, it's like seeing what was going on in locals. The rest of Australia wouldn't really have had much of an idea at all. And in terms of the rest of the world, absolutely none. Okay, so just going to have a look at a couple of fairly famous patrols that came out of Fremantle. So this is the Bowfin. This left Fremantle on the 1st of November in 43. Bowfin's a fairly famous submarine. There's a part of a museum now at Pearl Harbor. It was one of the highest ranked patrols. Sank. Was credited, I think, with 5 large vessels and 8 small craft, but it claimed 9. I think like sort of fighter pilots, they claimed maybe a little bit more than what they actually got, and then it was reviewed later on. But the Bowfin was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for this mission. This is probably the most famous patrol of all the submarines out of Fremantle. This is the 5th patrol with the USS Harder. So Operation Python, not really well-known operation involving the Z-Force Special Forces, was put into Borneo. So this is prior to the Samut one, which became more famous. Basically, it's not as famous because it didn't go very well. The local population wasn't quite ready for to turn ties on the Japanese at that stage. So a lot of them were, I guess, collaborators at that stage, and sort of the commandos were essentially run out of the area. The USS Harder was sent on a mission to rescue them. So this mission was really famous because essentially they claimed 5 destroyers, which was massive. They ended up getting credited with 4. They destroyed 2. The next day they picked up the commandos at night. So they picked up 6 members of Operation Python, which are the guys in the top right-hand corner. While these commandos were on board, they ended up sinking another 2 destroyers the next 2 nights. Then it conducted patrols for the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It's basically credited with turning the tide of the Battle of the Philippine Sea because essentially the Japanese thought there was this massive submarine fleet because all of a sudden all these destroyers were getting sunk. They've put their forces out earlier than expected and enabled the Americans to basically get the jump on them. Ended up picking Christie as well, and he ended up doing a patrol at the end of the patrol with them as well. And for his efforts, Commander Diller was given the Medal of Honor for this patrol. Sadly, it was sunk on its 6th patrol. So he was awarded his Medal of Honor posthumously. But yeah, amazing story. So just getting into some of the special reconnaissance missions. So what's, I guess, commonly known as Z-Force missions from Fremantle. So the Harder mission really showed the benefits of using submarines to go in and pick up and insert special forces rather than using planes or by parachute. So ended up being about 100 missions that were launched from Fremantle over that sort of 2-year period. Basically, either they'd go on board one of the subs that was going out on patrol, and they sort of mix it in with that patrol, or they'd actually have a specialised. A lot of the Dutch submarines would be primarily devoted to purely these sort of special forces operations. So they'd go out and do a lot of reconnaissance or sabotage, and also submarines were kind of also. Sorry, the Commandos were also kind of used as a bit of a boarding party as well. So they'd go and search a lot of the smaller vessels, particularly by the end of 44, 45. There weren't a lot of big ships left because the Americans had sunk a lot of them. So the Japanese were using a lot of the local smaller craft. So they would use Commandos to basically go and board them and suss out what was going on. So they were sort of trained in the use of that. The most famous mission that left from Fremantle was also one of the most spectacular disasters, was the Ramal missions which left. HMS Porpoise dropped the Commandos in. There was 23 of them, and essentially all men died on the mission, with 10 of them being executed. However, yeah, while it's been one of the more famous ones, it was, a lot of them were actually quite successful. So just quickly, the Operation Politician, which is in April 45, 2 Commandos which were aboard the Boarfish went aboard with their submersible canoes in the middle of the night and managed to blow up a railway. And then while the Japanese were all sort of scurrying around trying to work out what was going on, they slipped back out in their canoes and went back out to the submarine. So that's more of an example of probably what would happen, rather than the sort of rather unsuccessful Ramal mission. Careen Bay, which is Garden Island, which is now the home of the Australian submarine fleet, was used as a secret training base for all the submersible canoes and midget subs that were used in the area. So that's just a photo there in the middle. The bottom right, members of the Jaywick crew, which was the one that preceded the Ramal crew. So Ivan Lyon is the guy in the middle, who was the main commander for both of those.
Yeah, and I did a show about Jaywick with Lynette Silver a couple of years ago, and I've been meaning to invite her back to cover Ramal, because she wrote about both of them. And
her book on Ramal is like the gold standard on that.
I will. It's made. I'll make a note to email her and get that sorted out, because she was great.
Yeah, that's really good. They also, the British end up sending these mini subs down to Garden Island for trials as well. So they were used by the Commandos. They were never really, nothing officially was used in combat, but they were the Wellman and the Well Freighter mini subs that were used, and a lot of trials were done out of Frio for that. All right, so by the end of 44, a lot of the American submarines started moving out because the Philippines had been reconquered. The British had started arriving in force in 45. A lot of the American infrastructure and repair facilities stayed. Not all, and then the British were able to use those, because technically the British were actually under the American command at that stage. So this is HMS Adamant at the North Wharf, just again some more photos of the submarines in Fremantle. Okay, we're getting towards the end. 1945, Rear Admiral Fife takes control over Christie. Christie was moved on. Seems to be a little bit of conflict because he recommended Dealey for the Medal of Honor, and he felt pretty guilty because he was the one who actually then sent him out on the 6th mission, and he campaigned pretty hard to get the Medal of Honor, and a lot of the higher ups were pushing back on it. So it seems to be a little bit of political pushback as to why he was replaced, because he ended up, from memory, ending up in Alaska or something like that. So Fife took control. Again, a lot of them moved up into the Philippines, as that quote says there. By 45, they pretty much run out of major targets. They pretty much sunk everything that had gone on. They were mainly targeting small craft at that stage. This is the trenchant, so wasn't all small craft. This famously sunk the Ashigara, which was the biggest ship that the British Pacific Fleet had sunk during the Second World War. The Ashigara, because again the Japanese were so short-handed with merchant vessels, they were using all their military vessels for troop transport, and there was around 1,600 soldiers on board, and they all perished as part of that action, and the Commando was given the DSO for that. All right, this is probably a story I just included because I don't think a lot of people would have known about U-boats operating out of the Indian Ocean. So Durnitz, the head of the Christie or the submarines with Christie, had an idea that he was going to help out his Japanese allies. So it's the only time that the Japanese and the Germans actually worked together. He sent a few submarines to operate out of Jakarta in Indonesia. It was called Monsoon Force and then got called something else. It was, absolute spectacular disaster. I think only maybe 5 submarines made it back. Most of them were sunk or were captured at some stage. Apart from the U-862, which I called the rogue U-boat, essentially because the commander just went rogue, and rather than operating where he went off the south coast of Australia and attacked shipping down towards Tasmania and then across to New Zealand as well, and then he ended up coming back and sinking the Peter Sylvester, which was a US Liberty ship, which became the last Allied ship that was actually sunk in the Indian Ocean. He ended up making his way back up to Jakarta, and then by the time I think he got back, the Germans had actually surrendered. So he then handed himself over to the Japanese, and that U-boat was used briefly by the Japanese. But yeah, I don't think a lot of people would be aware that U-boats were operating in the Southern Oceans. Okay, so this is just a summary of the submarine actions out of Fremantle. So in total, around 170 submarines operated out of Fremantle between 42 and 45, conducting 341 patrols. I say around 170 because a few of those were on secret missions, so they weren't actually technically recorded as being on patrol, particularly the Dutch submarines. They were officially credited for 377 ships sunk for a total of over 1.5 million tons of shipping, and that doesn't include any of the small craft that they sunk, particularly in the 45 period. I couldn't get a total for the Fremantle submarines, but overall, the American submarines killed like 100,000 Japanese soldiers. Wow. Just in transportation alone, which you think about it. I think it was more than like most of like Iwo Jima, Okinawa, all those campaigns kind of combined in terms of how many soldiers. It's just pretty horrific to think about the way that those guys died, all probably drowning. But yeah, a huge number.
It's been a topic that I know James and Al have covered it on We Have Ways. The lack of discussion about the contribution of US submarines and indeed Royal Naval, Australian, Dutch as well in the Pacific. But yeah, it seems that the world has remembered the submarines from the North Atlantic and U-boats and all that, but kind of largely forgotten the story in your part of the world.
Yeah. We compare it to something like the strategic bombing campaigns and those sort of things. It was far more effective, the submarine campaign in the Pacific. It effectively strangled Japan, and I think one of the things that really kind of stands out is, like I said, they just didn't have a merchant fleet by the end of it. They didn't have an ability to move troops and transports around, so they'll end up using their military fleet, their navy, their submarines, and their battleships and stuff to end up as transports, which obviously isn't a very effective use of those sort of assets. So it just completely hamstrung the Japanese efforts in that the whole theatre. the graph in the bottom left is just the number of ships that were sunk over that period, and it's just that massive jump in 1944. So, like I said, obviously the actual sort of squadrons and everything got bigger. They sorted the submarines out, and the torpedoes also had broken all the Japanese codes by that stage, so they kind of had an idea of where all the Japanese shipping was moving. And another important thing, again, separate show, the Australian mine layers with Catalinas were essentially laying mines in all the Japanese harbours, forcing them into the deeper water, and then the American submarines were waiting for them as they got out into the deeper water. So just a massive combined effort by that sort of 44 period, absolutely decimated the Japanese forces during that time period. The two flags that I've got there are the two highest scoring subs that operated out of Fremantle, and they're both the highest scoring in terms of the overall war. So the Flasher had the highest tonnage, so over 100,000 tons of shipping, and the Tautog was the highest number of ships, so that had 26 ships sunk over that period. And the Tautog actually was one of the few submarines that lasted the whole battle. In fact, it was involved at Pearl Harbor, and I think it was like the first American that sort of drew blood. They actually, the gunner shot down one of the planes that was attacking Pearl Harbor, so it was actually one of the first ones involved. Those flags that I've just shown, and the photo, they're basically known as brag flags. So every time the submarine would come into harbour, and they'll basically sort of brag about what they'd done. So they'd sew these patches on, and so as the submarines would come in, they'd be flying the flag. So it would alert everyone, sort of, sort of poke their head out and see what had happened. And so, yeah, they're all sort of individual to each submarine, which is pretty much the only way to tell them apart, because they look the same. All right, so this is just wrapping up. So there were 8 submarines that were what now known as on eternal patrol that left from Fremantle. So they basically didn't come back, with 570 crew that died on board. The photo is of the US submarine monument that's now at the Fremantle War Memorial. So that was instituted as part of the commemoration for the submarine forces that operate out of Fremantle. Unfortunately, they gave us the Mark 14 torpedo, so I don't know if that meant they liked us or not. But that's part of the War Memorial. There are some other memorials that are around the place, but that's the major one. Okay, so this is the last slide. So this is the end of the war. So essentially, Fremantle then became the main port of call for all the returning prisoners of war. So the top 2 slides are prisoners of war that had returned to Fremantle. So the left one is the Australians, and then the right one is some Indian prisoners of war that had actually managed to get out, and they were staying in Fremantle until they could be repatriated back into India, which is, I think, a pretty cool photo. And the bottom photos just more show the social changes that happened in Fremantle. So obviously there were quite a number of relationships that had started up with the sailors, and so there were quite a number of war brides that ended up going back to America over that period. A lot of the Dutch servicemen ended up staying in Australia, obviously probably because there wasn't much to go home to, and some of the Americans ended up coming back in the post-war period, but a lot of those brides ended up going back to America on ships following up. And I'm pretty sure that's me done. So that photo I took the other night. That's on top of Cantonment Hill. That's the same spot where the first photo was taken from. So just showing the nice sunsets that we get over here.
Wow, what a fantastic debut performance. And given that my stomach is rumbling because it's dinner time and it's nearly 3 in the morning for you over there, we will do questions, or we'll just bring you back a second time or a third time and expand on. We'll do it to the vote. Which of these subjects that were covered tonight would you like Michael to expand on? I mean, whatever, we'll do that in the future. But what an amazing debut performance. What an incredible, comprehensive. We did race relations, we did fortifications, we did furry animals that we don't know over outside of Australia. We've done submarine operations, we've done U-boats, we've done commando missions, submersible canoes. There's not much we haven't covered. So fantastic performance. I'm so glad you offered it to me. And I will just extend the invite to come back at some point in the future.
No, great. Thank you.
Brilliant. So thanks, everybody. This is Paul Burdett for World War II TV. I will see you all again tomorrow night when we're talking about U.S. Marine Corps General with Amy and Dons. That'll be tomorrow. So thanks, everybody. I'll see you all again tomorrow. Bye.